Welcome to the Big Picture Podcast. I'm your co-host, Tracy Suhaki.
And I'm your co-host, John Suhaki. We are now in Tepoztlan, Mexico, at the Iboga Quest facility. This is a facility that helps people through recovery from opioid addictions and other ailments using medicinal chemistry, using the molecule ibogaine. The success they've been having here with the ibogaine treatment is remarkable. We are here today with a number of the members of the Iboga Quest team. Let's introduce them.
I'll start with introducing Donna Stevens, a registered nurse. Welcome.
It's good to be here.
And we also have Roger Guest, who is a licensed drug and alcohol therapist, meditation instructor, and much more. He's one of the original members of the Iboga Quest team. Roger Guest, welcome to the Big Picture Podcast.
Thank you, John and Tracy, and it's happy to be here.
And then we're very pleased and delighted to welcome Barry Rosanoff, who's actually the founder of Iboga Quest. We're just so happy that the three of you could sit down and talk with us and explain your work and the process of what it's like using ibogaine for treating some of these really serious addiction issues.
Barry, welcome to the Big Picture Podcast.
Well, it's great to be here to help educate people about the use of opiates and the efficacy of psychoactive substances to relieve what is an enormous challenge in our age.
Can we begin by talking about some of the stereotypes that just aren't accurate in terms of folks who are addicted to opioids? Roger?
Well, I think there are a lot of misconceptions about opioid addiction and any form of addiction. People associate hard drug use with a kind of lower class, rundown person who's no value to society and so on. But of course, that's really not true. Many of the people who found themselves in dependencies are professionals, tradespeople, educated from all walks of life. Commonly, what we see is a person who may have suffered some kind of an injury and been put on painkillers. For example, they've fractured a leg or arm and the doctor's given them OxyContin and their prescription runs out, their pain hasn't gone away. They seek painkillers from somewhere they can get them and often find themselves using heroin, or it used to be at least that people would find a way to heroin or some derivative, and in a position where it was very difficult to stop. Those drugs are very addictive. They become part of your life and they can take over your life. And so we've seen people who are very well off, very successful in their fields, so on, down to people who are trauma-ridden from a very young age.
And then the loved ones who are impacted by this.
You're also saying that people can be very functional and still suffer with addiction or still struggle with addiction.
Particularly opiates. There was a drinker, methamphetamine user, a heroin user, a cocaine user, and a marijuana smoker. And they tested how they drove, how they were able to get out of a smoky house that was on fire, how they were able to put together a IKEA table or something. And interestingly enough, the heroin user, in this case was a woman, she was able to drive better than anybody else. She was a little bit more together in terms of getting out of a smoky house and so on. Because basically it's a little different for opiates. The most difficult time of day for the opiate user is right before they get a fix. They are really disturbed. And then once they have the opiate in their system, they feel normal, more normal. They usually go through a period of sort of elation of some kind, but they can function quite normally as long as they have it in their system. It's when it starts to go away from there, they lose it, that they get irritable and so on.
Opiate users are vilified in our culture. Yet the history of it is ancient. It's been used for an awfully long time. And just as with alcohol, there are people who, once they begin using an opiate, they really have a lot of difficulty moving away from it. And the latest data that I've seen on that indicates somewhere around 10% of the users, the people who have used opiates, become dependent.
I just want to add to this, people could be functioning, but barely. At some point in time, their lives do begin to fall apart because they're not showing up for work, they're not showing up for their families, so relationships suffer. So in fact, their lives do begin to fall apart. And it's usually at that point when people are really desperate, because no one wants to be addicted to heroin. No one wants to be addicted to fentanyl. These are very, very powerful medications. Just to underscore what Barry and Roger have said, these are our school teachers and bus drivers and children. From my background as someone who worked in the States at a drug and alcohol treatment center, traditional treatment simply not working. There's probably a success rate of about 5% of people who come into treatment that actually do stay clean and sober.
Could you describe what that traditional treatment typically is?
Sure. Usually, typical treatment would be maybe 7 days, anywhere from 7 to 10 days in a detox unit, where depending upon the drug that one is addicted to would determine the treatment. So, for example, for alcohol, you may receive a taper with a medication called Librium or Ativan. And for opiate users, it's traditionally a medication called Suboxone. So you're treating the addiction during that withdrawal period, which is the most difficult time. And from there, hopefully, people go for longer treatments, 28-day programs, 30-day programs, or longer. And unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. So I can say from my own experience of coming down here for the last several years and actually witnessing the power and potency of this plant medicine in relieving cravings and relieving withdrawal symptoms, because those are generally the two things that will send an opiate user out again to use. After an Ibogaine experience, people generally emerge withdrawal-free and craving-free. That's the gift of Ibogaine. It's often referred to as an addiction interrupter. So this is a very valuable time where an addict can work with meditation, work with therapy, work with other support groups. They have the opportunity for a fresh start with Ibogaine.
Back to that theme about the misconception about opiates. A lot of the people who are really in trouble with opiates, they need to go onto the street to engage with people that they don't want to engage with. They don't know what the purity is of what they're using. They don't know how to be able to monitor it and use clean needles. I feel personally, and this is very much a personal view, that opiates have their place. It bothers me a lot that the war on drugs has put so many people behind bars, has ruined so many lives.
Why would you ever think of having a physician doing a policeman's job? So with the war on drugs, I'm saying, well, what the heck is a policeman doing with a physician's job? It's a medical issue. We're dealing with people's lives in terms of a chemical, which is a medicine. If lives are being ruined by it, they need help. The last thing you should do is throw them behind bars. You need to get them to treatment. It's a medical issue.
It's also a kind of a mantra or a theme in the drug and alcohol world, treatment world, that the drug isn't the problem. The drug is the solution to the problem. And the true problem that we're finding, a lot of people coming here to Iboga Quest, they're suffering on one hand from addiction, but why did they get addicted in the first place may have a lot to do with trauma or negative experiences of childhood and so on, and other habitual patterns and, we could say, mental disorders that accompany and are actually embedded in addiction.
So I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about where does ibogaine come from and how was it used historically, because you talked about opioids having a real ancient history.
To get into the history of Iboga, which is a sacramental substance used by a group of peoples called the Buitis in Gabon and Cameroon, and I think part of the Congo. I'd rather begin at the contemporary view of it, which was an accidental occurrence. It was the late 1960s, and for many of the people in the East Coast and the West Coast, we were experimenting with a lot of things. I'm, for one, am lucky to be here to be able to talk about it. I've had some interesting experiences, but it was an individual. He was a graduate student. He was also a junkie. And by that I mean he was a dependent on heroin. He and a group of people took ibogaine, which came from a pharmaceutical company, I think in Switzerland, called Ciba-Geigy. He recognized after taking it that he did not want to shoot up, to use the vernacular. And the same thing was true of the others, a couple of whom simply said, well, I'd rather continue to use. As a little bit of a divergent of that, I'm the one that does most of the screening for people who come here to do ibogaine. And my primary question is, are you sure that you don't want to be using this anymore? Puts them on a spot in many instances, and they really have to get into a deep question of themselves. Because even though ibogaine really does stop the withdrawal, which is the thing that scares the hell out of people who are on opiates. Usually, if they haven't done it on the floor of a prison cell, they've never been able to go through it. And even once they have, they continue to have the cravings. So going back to what Donna said, this is the great gift of this molecule called ibogaine, which is extracted from the root bark of the Iboga plant and is one of several, I think they say around 12 alkaloids. There are 12 alkaloids within the Iboga plant, and nobody is really certain about this. Remember that, this war on drugs has been so catastrophic. I mean, there was tremendous amount of investigation taking place prior to the late 60s, and it all got shut down, and it was pretty thorough, the shutting down of all the universities that were doing work on it. The chemists were unable to secure the materials, and certainly there wasn't anything like a human trial.
Prior to the clampdown, psychedelics in general were really becoming forefront of research, but ibogaine was lumped into a family of drugs that came to be known as hallucinogens or psychedelics.
Ibogaine is not a drug of abuse, which is in and of itself quite fascinating. And what we often find is people who come for addiction really have the opportunity to have this one treatment and be done and be free.
One treatment, it's not like this lifelong thing that you have to stick with.
There certainly are occasions where people do relapse and may need to come back for an additional treatment, but it's far superior than how we're treating people with substance use disorders in this country.
Barry, you're talking about how you have to screen people and how that's so important, that they need to truly, genuinely want to get off their addiction.
The person who is going to be treated must want to be. But we do see that people have a pretty easy time, relatively speaking, of staying off of the opiate dependency for a good 3 months, which gives them a breath.
So there's some wonderful, sort of almost miraculous qualities to this plant medicine, and they're certainly not well understood because, as we pointed out, the research that was accumulating and the train of research was really rolling down the tracks and suddenly got stopped. And it's only now beginning to kick back into gear. So we've lost valuable time foolishly and crazily. It's just
valuable lives.
Many thousands, millions perhaps of lives. At any rate, the other thing I wanted to point out about ibogaine that's really different than, say, Suboxone or methadone or any other maintenance therapies is that when someone does an ibogaine treatment, it's not just that their brain is making different connections through the way that the molecule works in the receptors and so on. There's an experience of life review, looking at why am I like this? How did I get this way? You know, this often pent up anger or fear or deep heartbreak, sadness, perhaps traumatic experiences of who knows what in the background that are psychologically powerful forces that have become part of the addiction process insofar as when we are in pain, nobody wants to suffer, so we find something and self-medicate. So what ibogaine can do is take one to a place through this psychological element where there's often a degree of forgiveness, for example, or some kind of almost unconscious understanding of the forces and a way of looking at it differently. Within this 3-month window that Barry was referring to, there's also a chance to take in this information that you've received during an ibogaine treatment. The medication, the plant, seems almost to take the role of a therapist or a teacher. The one who receives it and works with this with the proper help can start to have a kind of different outlook to themselves and to the world, which is a huge element of recovery in this 3-month period particularly, but going forward. They're no longer angry at their father, so it's no longer necessary to medicate that pain.
I'm hearing that the ibogaine provides a break from just withdrawal symptoms, but also that it gives you psychologically a fresh start.
A break from the storyline, the perpetual storyline that just keeps going around.
You know, each person's case is very different. There's no one experience anyone can predict. But we've definitely seen people who have come out of an ibogaine situation, sort of things like, I no longer hate myself, or I feel like I can deal with this now when I couldn't before. I've left behind my bitterness. Or they just feel inspired, like, I want to learn more about myself. I want to stop running away from what I've been running away from a fear or a symptom. And I want to study and learn more about myself. And so there's often this spiritual element of introspection and possibility of a fresh outlook. And of course, if you have that kind of experience and you go back to your old life and you're with your old friends in the same, eating in the same restaurant and talking about the same football game, you're pretty soon going to start losing this new perspective. So it's very important we truly emphasize this element of aftercare or continuing care.
I endorse what Roger was just saying, and also want to point out that in the culture of the West, the real gateway drug tends to be alcohol. People going back to the same social environment and with the same friends, having a couple of glasses of wine, are much more susceptible. But there's an enigma that I've been curious about for a decade or longer, and that is what kind of information is actually contained in a molecule. Aside from its obvious biochemical interaction with mental processes, there seems to be imagery that comes with the ibogaine molecule.
This might go into a little bit of talking us through what it's like for somebody to go through a Iboga Quest experience.
Well, most poignant one was one of the very first people we ever treated, a woman living here in Mexico from Switzerland. She and her husband, they had a 2.5-year-old who drowned. She was living with the pain of that. And when I met her at a meditation session, actually, and she learned that I was associated with some work with ibogaine, and called and asked if we could make this available to her, and I said yes. And she described a situation where a large black African woman whose face she never saw came and extended her hand and said, "I'm going to give you a tour of your pain body because you're always going to have this pain, and so you need to know where it is in order to liberate the rest of you." She's still doing great, and her husband was there when the child drowned and had been drinking, and she was able to forgive him.
So let me ask, the ibogaine treatment is not just for opioid addictions. Can you talk about what other conditions you find it's helpful for?
Well, we do a lot of work with people who are suffering from mood disorders, often PTSD. Sometimes people have applied for the purpose of, they seem to be somewhere blocked in a spiritual way. They feel like they're practicing maybe something, meditation or yoga, and they're not getting anywhere, and they want to see if something can break through. But a lot of psycho-spiritual or mood disorder type things, depression. This is why it's really tragic that there hasn't been more research, more money available, and so on. But we have seen sporadic examples of people with things like fibromyalgia or beginning level Parkinson's and other kinds of ailments, and they've left feeling like, God, my hand's not shaking anymore, or the pain is gone. Pain that they could not find, traditional medicine could not find a solution for. We can't claim that it's effective 90% of the cases of, Parkinson's or something like that. But there are occasions where people didn't come for that reason, but they leave feeling this amazing relief.
I'm glad you brought that up because we do more than once in a while see people who are coming here to do some kind of personal investigation dealing with depression and other disorders, and never even mention that, I've had this pain in my neck for the last 14 years, and I woke up this morning realizing I don't have it anymore. And that is not that unusual. But to represent it to somebody who wants to relief for that condition, we would be, as Roger said, irresponsible to do so.
My sense here is that there's such a strong connection between mind and body. And what we're talking about here is ibogaine, which is a support for the mind. It would be no surprise that in turn helps the body. And there are many ailments that are complicated by what the mind is thinking. It can help that ailment, it can make that ailment all the worse. And so if you're helping the mind, you're going to help the body.
The scourge of fentanyl, which has changed the landscape entirely from what used to be relatively easy to take a heroin addict who was just using heroin and guide them through the process. They'd come out the other end, and we could really see some significant change, and it was very helpful. With fentanyl, which is now everywhere, someone will arrive having not had anything in their system theoretically for a few days and still test positive for fentanyl for 4, 5, 6, 7 days. They're basically going into withdrawal, and it's a medically challenging situation. It's very dangerous, and it's just horrendous. Information about Ibogaine is finding its way into the bigger world, and there are people who think, oh, I'll just order some online and take it at home, and it'll work. Why should I come all the way to Mexico, and so on? I just hope you've gotten the picture already that is a very bad idea.
I was just going to ask why ibogaine might be considered dangerous and why there's some reports of death.
Like any other substance, it can be dangerous. There are two factors that have been associated with mortalities. One is a undisclosed heart condition. One of the things that we screen for that's very important is what they call the QT interval, the amount of time that it takes for a heart to go through its cycle. And if it is prolonged, ibogaine has a tendency to prolong it further, and it can lead to heart failure. The other more prevalent one is where somebody has done ibogaine, but they're not really interested in stopping their opiate habit. They go and use opiates, and as Roger suggested, with it being potentiated by at least 4 times, they overdose, doing what they had been doing on a regular basis. They now have gone back to ground zero. But among the people who are credible ibogaine providers that I'm familiar with, this is just not a hazard. We make sure it's safety first.
Please, listener, take this message. It needs to be under expertise, supervision. It has a good safety record and high efficacy, but it needs to be done properly under medical supervision to be sure.
And it is worth mentioning that when you are buying ibogaine from the internet, you really do not know what you're getting. Just as a general rule, know your supplier.
I want to go back to what Roger was talking about with the fentanyl. We understand fentanyl is an opioid. We understand about the opioid receptor site. Recall the morphine molecule binds into this receptor site, but you can tweak that molecule a little bit, add acetyl groups to those phenols, and you end up with heroin. Heroin binds even better to that opioid receptor site, about 6 times better, if I recall right. Roger was mentioning this opioid called fentanyl. That's 50 times as potent as morphine. Why is this important? Well, consider if you're in the illicit drug trade and you're trying to move these opioids around. You know, if it's 50 times as potent, you don't need as much. You can ship around tiny, tiny little grains, and that will be sufficient. Roger, could you talk a little bit about the problem with fentanyl when it comes to street drugs?
As you've said, fentanyl is extremely powerful, and there are now massive amounts of stories of people who have bought something on the street thinking it was ecstasy or thinking it was cocaine, and it turns out that it's laced with fentanyl, and they have overdosed, not knowing what they were taking. One of the biggest problems in the surge of overdoses is when people have been using opiates for a length of time, they gain the body becomes familiar with the drug, they need a little bit more. And they find a dose that deals with their anxiety or their cravings and gets them a little high. That's sort of where they're at, is, maybe it's 5 bags a day. And then they try and get off the drug. They wean themselves down, they go to treatment, they spend a period of a month or 2 without anything. And they're doing well, and the way these things work, it's sort of like giving yourself a pat on the back for not drinking by going out and having a drink. And they'll take 5 bags of what they used to use, and they'll overdose because it'll have fentanyl in it, which means that 5 bags is the equivalent of 25 bags or 30 bags, and so their body is simply not, the receptors are working on a different scale. So many millions of stories like this where they've gone into overdose, they've had to be resuscitated, and sometimes haven't been, expecting the same result as what they would have expected before, but getting something quite different.
I mean, it is, after all, a synthetic. The cost of making it is a lot less than the cost of growing poppies or nearly anything else. So you have a situation where someone had a knee injury and they were one of those 10% that became opioid dependent. And then the crackdown came after the Sackler family, and the doctors became afraid of prescribing it. And addiction and withdrawal is very real. If you haven't seen somebody going into withdrawal, it's difficult to imagine. So they go to the street drugs. You're going to be seeing people with this fentanyl addiction. It's much more addictive than heroin. Getting off of it is extremely difficult. They're going to have to be able to devote their time, their resources, and otherwise their tolerance is going to grow. And they're never going to know what it really is that they're taking. They may call it fentanyl, but it can be all kinds of modifications of that molecule. We had over 100,000 deaths in the year 2021. I'm sure that was an undercount. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of people. That's more people than died in any kind of car accident. Mm-hmm. So what are we going to do as a society? Are we going to let the pharmaceutical companies and the bureaucracies steal our children? But that is what's happening.
Ibogaine is a plant medicine. And the sacredness of these plants sets it aside from other forms of treatment. The mindset that we try to inspire with people who are here is a reverence for the medicine that is in sync with a reverence for life, a reverence for their own true nature. Ibogaine is one of many plant medicines that have a particularly significant role bringing people back to their spiritual core and that general sense of connection that has been lost. It's a key player in this bigger picture.
Tracy and I are now reading a book that Donna lent to us on the hidden lives of trees. Do you know that trees talk to each other by way of their roots and the fungi? There's all this interconnectivity that is going on in and around us. When we respect nature, we honor nature, we need to identify the power of nature. We're talking millions and millions of years of evolution behind it. It is smart. And who are we to think that we could be smarter than it? So yeah, when we go ahead and we take what nature has produced and we tweak it, I can see there's value in that, but there's also danger in that. And that, in my mind, is what has happened with the molecule fentanyl. It's very, very powerful. Yeah, you're going to have some benefits, but you're also necessarily going to have risks. And I think what I'm hearing from our guests here is that let's get down to the basics, let's get down to the ground. We've found a plant material, a natural product within ibogaine that supports us in many of our ailments. It helps connect the mind and the body together. That is a good thing. And ibogaine being just one of many other plant materials that require further investigation. Wouldn't it be wonderful if that could be supported by the government so that we could learn so much more? There's so much more to learn. It begins, in my mind, with science literacy, so that there's a general public who understands the depth of what's around them and a respect for what's around them, and you will elect people who are like-minded so that things can actually move forward and not hold us back. Donna, Roger, And Barry, thank you so much for joining us here at the Big Picture Podcast. It's quite the honor to be with you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, what an important conversation.
You guys were great.
Thank you.